we received this question by a text from Michael in Dallas. And here's how it reads. He says, "Hello, friends. I have a question regarding 1 Corinthians 11. Paul is stating that women should not pray without their heads being covered. I have a friend who stopped a female from praying over Sabbath lunch because her head wasn't covered. Is that the right thing to do?" So, Pastor Jacobson, so perhaps you can begin with this one.
Yes.
What does the Bible say?
Since it is for women, huh?
Start us off.
All right. So he's referring to specifically 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 5, where it says, "But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved." And this passage is part of being at worship. So this is a worship service. They all gather together. And he's telling them, the verse before that, he says, a man praying should not have his head covered, but the woman should. So how do we understand this passage? Well, the thing that's key in this passage is the first verse and the last verse. And so verse 2 is the beginning, where it says, "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you." That's the key here. So he's talking about, I have brought you traditions, I have brought you teachings that we want you to follow. And then in the last verse of this passage, which is verse 16, in verse 16 it says, "But if anyone seems to be contentious, as in arguing about this issue, that women should uncover their heads, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God." So he's saying, overall, when women go in public, this is what they do. They cover their heads, just as men uncover them. And so he's saying, if you go to worship and somebody comes and visits your worship, do you want them to think that you are following what the society does, or do you want them to think that you're different? And the problem with being different is that there are many scholars who say the fact that the woman uncovered her head signified that she was a prostitute. And so if people would have entered that worship, it really would have been, okay, well, who are these people really then, right? Because you're sending the wrong message, and that's what Paul is telling them. Pay attention to how you're doing this, because you may be sending the wrong message. So he's not saying, he's not trying to restrict the women. He's saying, pay attention to who you are as a community. How are you portraying Christ and God?
Okay. All right.
I think, too, this is a situation where we have to apply the principle of what we call the HelpDesk identification, where there's only one particular verse in Scripture that deals with a topic, or one particular topic in the Bible that's dealt with only one time. And you cannot form a doctrine when you only have one verse or one passage that deals with a particular issue. So I think the bigger question is, and you pointed out a lot of that, is what do we do today? What does it mean for us today? That's the way it was in the Corinthian tradition. But what about us today? And Paul dealt with this same issue with the church at Corinth when he talked about meat being offered to idols. He said, listen, if you have a problem with that, then you don't eat the meat offered to idols. But don't force someone else to go against their conscience because you cause them to sin. So I think this was more of a cultural issue. And because it's only mentioned once in the entire Bible, we cannot form a doctrine on that.
Yeah. And we don't wear head covering all the time in public. So
not in this culture.
Yeah, it's all about context.
It's context.
Context.
Yeah,
All
it's
right.
context.
Well, that's great principles to share there. Context is key.